of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings is a reference to a certain holiday that many of us know and love. Well, a sort of reference. The moment happens late in the book, several months after the destruction of the ring. The scene is Hobbiton, after the Shire has been scoured of the ruffians, and of Saruman, and of Lotho Sackville Baggins, and of Grima Wormtongue. The focus now is on the rebuilding effort, and we read, "The labor of repair went on apace. Hobbits can work like bees when the mood and the need comes on them. Now there were thousands of willing hands of all ages. Before Yule, not a brick was left standing of the new sheriff houses, or of anything that had been built by Sharkey's men. But the bricks were used to repair many an old hole, to make it snugger and drier. Great stores of goods and food, and beer, were found that had been hidden away by the ruffians in sheds and barns and deserted holes, so that there was a great deal better cheer that Yule than anyone had hoped for." Did you notice it? It's mentioned twice. Yule. And of course, Yule is the time of year when that certain holiday I was talking about happens, that being Christmas. Now, does the reference mean that there is Christmas in Middle-earth? Well, I wouldn't say that. After all, this is not Narnia, where in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book of the C.S. Lewis series, and don't let anyone ever tell you that The Magician's Nephew comes first. In that book, it's revealed that the White Witch has made the land always winter and never Christmas. Think of that, Mr. Tumnus says to Lucy Pevensey. One of the first signs of the loosening of the hold that the White Witch has had over Narnia is literally the appearance of Father Christmas. No allegory there. Middle-earth, on the other hand, operates on very different terms, which preclude the presence of such an individual, whether he's named Father Christmas, Santa Claus, Père Noël, what have you. Let's look at why. In letter 211, Tolkien talks about Middle-earth not being another planet, meaning that it is this planet. And he goes on from there to talk about the evidently long but undefined gap in time between the fall of Barad-dûr and our days. He's specifically referring to this gap being sufficient for literary credibility, but it's the footnote to the word gap which is interesting here. It reads, "I imagine the gap to be about 6,000 years. To further emphasize what this means in the context of Christmas, we have letter 165, where Tolkien says, "I am in any case myself a Christian, but the Third Age was not a Christian world." Definitely not if it was 6,000 years ago. Jesus lived a little over 2,000 years ago. And since the word Christmas literally means the Mass of Christ, if you don't have a Christ, you can't have a Christmas. QED. And yet, the holiday does make an appearance within the Legendarium, specifically in The Hobbit. Christmas is referred to once, and it would have been twice if Tolkien had kept to his original draft, where he describes Elrond as being as kind as Christmas. This fact appears in the excellent exploration of the manuscript history of The Hobbit by John Ratliff. The reference, though, was changed to as kind as summer in the published text, which is curious in its own right, since summer and Christmas are pretty much opposites of each other, although both are warm and friendly seasons in their own way. The sole reference to Christmas that does appear in the published text is in the Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire chapter. The dwarves and Bilbo and Gandalf are trying to get away from the goblins and wargs, and are chased up into some trees. And the narrator tells us, "You would have laughed, from a safe distance, if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Fili and Kili were at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree." Now, this would seem a strange comparison to make if taken as being within a work written in tandem with The Lord of the Rings, which, again, exists in a pre-Christian world. But The Hobbit was not written that way. It was independently conceived, as Tolkien states in letter 131 to Milton Waldman. Adding on to that, John Ratliff tells us at one point in his book that an important fact people often overlook in discussing The Hobbit is that it was originally written for a very specific audience, Tolkien's 3 sons, they being John, Michael, and Christopher. Priscilla, Tolkien's daughter, admitted to being a bit too young to remember the stories that were The Hobbit as they were originally read out, often, as John later stated, during Christmas time. Ratliff continues, while this is widely known as a biographical detail, few take into account the degree to which their likes and dislikes played a part in shaping the story. He goes on from there to specifically discuss bears, who appear prominently in a number of Tolkien's stories for his children. Within The Hobbit, of course, we have Beorn, the shape-shifting man-bear. But there are more examples of things inserted to please the boys. For instance, they knew their fairy tales well, thanks to their father, and there are loads of fairy tale elements within the story. Now, Tolkien had been writing his own fairy tales, and myths, and legends, and poems, many of which would later become the Silmarillion, for over a decade before he set pen to paper to craft The Hobbit to read to his boys. But again, those writings had nothing to do with this new work. Independently conceived, remember. There are some references within The Hobbit to things which appear in those earlier stories, the names of Elrond and Gondolin, for example, as well as allusions to the issues existing between elves and dwarves, or the wood elves being descended from the ancient tribes that never went to Fairy in the West. In letter 15, Tolkien notes, the magic and mythology and assumed history and most of the names, for example, the epic of the fall of Gondolin, are, alas, drawn from unpublished inventions known only to my family. He says it was known to a few others too, but since his family did know about this stuff, surely it would also have appealed to this audience of his, to whom he was writing The Hobbit for. They're really just there to be there, for them, and undoubtedly Tolkien too, and not because of any larger context. I did not know as I began it, Tolkien continued in his letter to Milton Waldman, that it belonged, meaning to a larger story. It was not until The Hobbit was published in September of 1937 and a sequel requested by his publisher, first dubbed simply The Hobbit sequel, then The Magic Ring, and then The Lord of the Rings, that Tolkien gradually brought this new work together with that which he had been writing all along. So all of it, the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, was now one giant story, or the Legendarium, as we all refer to it now. In doing so, Tolkien had to revise a few things. The Silmarillion underwent major changes, the author trying to reconcile it with what he had created within The Lord of the Rings. Changes so monumental in many cases that Tolkien himself was never able to bring the book to publication in his lifetime. That Herculean task had to fall to his son Christopher. The Hobbit underwent changes too, most notably in the Riddles in the Dark chapter, where Bilbo's encounter with Gollum had to be tweaked for the second edition, published in 1951, to fit the new character of Gollum as he now existed in The Lord of the Rings, the first installment of which, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published in 1954. He also had to fix the way Bilbo gets the ring. Douglas Anderson, in his The Annotated Hobbit, breaks down the differences. The stakes of the riddle contest are slightly different. It was still Bilbo's life if he lost, but if he won, Gollum would give him a present.
Must we give it the thing, precious? Yes, we must. We must fetch it, precious, and give it the present we promised.
So Gollum paddled back to his boat. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it? Lost! Lost, my precious! Lost! Lost! Bless us and splash us! We haven't the present we promised, and we haven't even got it for ourselves!
You can read this version of the chapter in a first edition of The Hobbit, which, if you happen to have, congratulations. Depending on the quality of the book, you're sitting on tens of thousands of dollars. But you can also read it less expensively in Douglas Anderson's book. And it's that version which Bilbo refers to at the Council of Elrond, differentiating it from the true story that we all know. The story from the first edition, the gift version, let's call it, would have been what Bilbo told the dwarves when he finally revealed the ring to them. If some have heard me tell it otherwise, he says, I ask them to forget it and forgive me. I only wished to claim the treasure as my very own in those days, and to be rid of the name of thief that was put on me. Okay, so Tolkien changed a few things, understandably. And yet, Fili and Kili were at the top of a tall larch like an enormous Christmas tree, remained. Any particular reason? Well, a reason for that could be the writing of the book itself. And I don't mean for his sons, because in the strictly meta sense, Tolkien is not the author of the book. He is merely a translator. This is revealed on the title page of the book. See those runes? They're not merely decorative. They actually say something. And that is, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, being the record of a year's journey made by Bilbo Baggins of Hobbiton, compiled from his memoirs by J.R.R. Tolkien, and published by George Allen and Unwin Limited. The Lord of the Rings does the same thing. The runes there read, The Lord of the Rings translated from the Red Book of Westmarch by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Herein is set forth the history of the War of the Ring and the Return of the King as seen by the Hobbits. And so, as a translator, Tolkien is merely adding words and phrases that will mean something to, and thus make the story moments be better understood by, his modern readers. Because of this, we get the odd references to the present, such as, it is not unlikely that they, the goblins, invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. Or specific comparisons to modern things, like at the beginning of the book, where Bilbo's shriek bursts out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. Or of Beorn at the Battle of Five Armies. The roar of his voice was like drums and guns. And of course, that enormous Christmas tree. After all, what better way is there to describe something hanging from a tree that most modern readers would instantly understand? Like the rest, anachronistic though they might be, Tolkien, the translator, introduced them and let them stand. What's curious here is that since there is this intrusion of Christmas into The Hobbit, it only seems fair that The Hobbit intrude itself upon Christmas. And it did. Because one of the ways that Tolkien celebrated Christmas with his family is by what has become known as the Father Christmas letters. Not unlike C.S. Lewis's Father Christmas appearing before the Pevensey children, so too does Father Christmas appear before the Tolkien children, at least in an epistolary way. Tolkien produced a series of letters from 1920 through 1943 from Father Christmas to, at first, his son John, then John and Michael, then all the boys, then all the children, then Christopher and Priscilla, and finally just Priscilla. They're a delightful set which have been published in various forms over the years, and encapsulate not merely the letters themselves, written in Father Christmas's voice, and in his hand as well, with a jittery script done because it's so cold up in the North Pole. But there are also envelopes and stamps and illustrations of all the activities which Father Christmas wanted to share with the children, even letting his friend and foil at times, North Polar Bear, write his own missives to the kids. There's that presence of a bear again. The letters through the 1920s contain some very fun tales. By December 1932, though, something has happened. Tolkien had completed a draft of The Hobbit sufficiently that he could give a typescript of it to his friend C.S. Lewis. This, per the Tolkien chronology, is published by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull. So, the work was very much on his mind, and would have been for his children too, to whom he had been reading it. And the Father Christmas letter that year has some, I would say, rather Hobbity elements going on. The comparisons are not glaring, but I think they're worth noting. It begins by Father Christmas telling of North Polar Bear getting lost. He says he found a hole in the side of a hill and went inside because it was snowing. He slipped down a long slope, and lots of rocks fell after him, and he found he could not climb up or get out again. In The Hobbit, Bilbo and the dwarves encounter a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away. The Father Christmas letter continues. Almost at once he, North Polar Bear, smelt goblin, and became interested and started to explore. Not very wise, for of course goblins can't hurt him, but their caves are very dangerous. Over in The Hobbit, of course, Bilbo and the dwarves encounter lots of goblins too, as they go down to Goblin Town, or into their abominable tunnels. Father Christmas goes on to tell us, goblins are to us very much what rats are to you, only worse because they are very clever. In The Hobbit, the narrator tells us, now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. Along with the letter, we also get Father Christmas's illustration of the caves that North Polar Bear was eventually found in. Quite long and thin with hunger, as he had been in the caves about a fortnight. Which, incidentally, is at least how long the dwarves are stuck in the caves of the wood elves in The Hobbit. Eventually, after a week or two, he, Bilbo, managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. The illustration shows many cave paintings, including one of a dragon looking suspiciously like the image Tolkien will later draw of Smaug. And this little fellow has been likened to Gollum himself. Again, it's not an overt rewrite or anything like that, but the echoes do have a consistency about them. Cut to a year later, and in the December 1933 letter, Father Christmas tells the Tolkiens, or my dears, that it's another Christmas, and I almost thought at one time that there would not be one this year. My pictures tell you part of the story. Goblins. The worst attack we have had for centuries. It would take too long to describe it, so I have tried to draw a picture of what I saw. This is very nice of him, but North Polar Bear feels a need to correct things by writing, only there was more like 1,000 goblins than 15. To which Father Christmas says, but you could hardly expect me to draw 1,000. He does go on to say, though, that Polar Bear was squeezing, squashing, trampling, and boxing and kicking goblins sky high and roaring like a zoo, and the goblins were yelling like engine whistles. He was splendid. He was also, I should say, mimicking another bear battling goblins. No? Now, I am not saying that these letters, or even just these two in particular, are in any way part of the Legendarium. They are very much their own thing, independently conceived, as was The Hobbit, and never made their way into the larger Lord of the Rings story the way that The Hobbit and the Silmarillion did. The 1932 and 1933 letters simply contain echoes of what he was working on at the same time, lifted up and dropped into it in a similar way that he lifted elements from the Silmarillion and dropped them into the Hobbit. A little bit of fun for the kids, and maybe for himself too. Christmas is still Christmas, however, existing for the children and us in the letters, and in the Hobbit only as a reference from the translator. And despite Gandalf's fireworks being described anachronistically as passing by like an express train, The Lord of the Rings remains fairly free of modern references, and none to Christmas. But the 1932 Father Christmas letter does make a reference to Old Grandfather Yule, which brings us back to that word which does appear in The Lord of the Rings. Now, in the spirit of all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, all Christmas celebrations are in essence Yule celebrations. But not all Yule celebrations are Christmas. Because Yule is simply a festival celebrated at the end of the year by ancient Germanic and Norse peoples, like many other such celebrations centered around the winter solstice, same as Saturnalia in ancient Rome, or the Jewish Festival of Lights, and so on. It's a good time to celebrate, as the solstice marks the shortest day of the year. Every day afterward, the sun stays out just a little bit longer, leading the world away from the cold and dark of winter into the brighter, warmer days of spring and eventually summer. It is, in essence, the celebration of the reemergence of light in the world, which is why the early Christians co-opted these end-of-year celebrations by placing the birth of Jesus, that symbol of light coming into the world, at this time of year. There is, of course, no reference within the Gospels as to what time of year Jesus was actually born, so why not have it near the solstice? People are celebrating already. The temptation now is to quote Romans 13:12. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. And to go back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the appearance of Father Christmas as a symbol of the end of winter and the beginning of spring is actually quite apt. Perhaps there was an allegorical element after all. Because, whether you're a Narnian, a Norseman, or from North Farthing, this is a good thing to celebrate, as the warmer months are certainly kinder to people than those cold and dark ones, which is undoubtedly why Tolkien chose to compare Elrond to summer when, for whatever reason, he deemed Christmas as not being an option. So, while it's uncertain if the Gondorians, or the Rohirrim, or the dwarves, or the elves celebrate the Yule, we know from the text that the hobbits do. It's a turning of the corner, which the hobbits at this time are really doing. They are rid of the ruffians, who could easily be described in the same way the Hobbit narrator describes the goblins, cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. Or the way Father Christmas does, very much what rats are to you. Their end ought to be good enough, but the finding of all that food and beer is most welcome indeed. Because, as Frodo and the other hobbits discover when they finally return to the Shire, there is, and has been, very little of anything. Food, beer, pipeweed. Hob Hayward says, "We grows a lot of food, but we don't rightly know what becomes of it. It's all these gatherers and sharers, I reckon, going round and measuring and taking off to storage. They do more gathering than sharing, and we never see most of the stuff again." The ruffians surely have had plenty. No shortages for them. And that fact undoubtedly left the hobbits feeling the same way that Pippin does in Minas Tirith, when he says to Baragond, "I'm not used to waiting hungry on others while they eat. It is a sore trial for a hobbit, that." The hobbits of the Shire have had a sore trial indeed, but that is now over. The darkness is coming to an end, and there is light ahead. There's even more to look forward to, although they don't know it, come the spring, when Sam's forestry work, as it's called, his replanting of trees and such around the Shire, really comes into its own. thanks not merely to his work, but also the influence of the dust from Galadriel's garden. Spring surpassed his wildest hopes. His trees began to sprout and grow, as if time was in a hurry and wished to make 1 year do for 20. But that's still to come. In the immediate moment, they get to celebrate the Yule in the same way they celebrate everything, with food and drink. And in this case, there was a great deal better cheer that Yule than anyone had hoped for. And while they are enjoying themselves, I will close with the words of Tolkien himself, this time in a letter to his adult son, Michael. Well, here comes Christmas, that astonishing thing that no commercialism can in fact defile, unless you let it. I hope, my dearest, that it will bring you some rest and refreshment in every way. A Merry Christmas, and God bless you all. And although I really can't end any better than that, I must say that that reference to the Yule is one of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.